You're listening to episode 23 of Literacy in Color. This week, we're joined with Dr. Heather Kenny, who believes that everyone has the right to read and that educators and parents deserve to be equipped with the knowledge and resources needed to teach reading right. Heather has extensive experience as a classroom teacher, reading interventionist, and professional development facilitator. For over a decade, she taught in a nationally recognized graduate reading program, training teachers to become reading specialists. She's a published author, an Orton Gillingham-trained dyslexia tutor, a national presenter on literacy topics, and a keynote speaker. And as president and founder of Unleashed Innovation, she consults with schools, districts, and other educational organizations to improve literacy outcomes and to design curriculum and resources to support all learners. Dr. Kenny is the co-creator of Sounder and Friends, an animated educational adventure series and app that encourages young children to notice and play with the sounds of spoken words. Today, we're talking with Dr. Kenny about the importance of reading fluency. And if you didn't get a chance to tune into last week's episode 22 with Jessica Farmer from Farmer Loves Phonics on what is reading fluency, go back before tuning into this one. It's a complimentary 2-part series all about fluency. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hey everyone! Today we are joined by Heather Kenny, and I am so excited to have her on as a guest because she really is one of the pioneers in sharing about the science of reading before it was even coined as a term in the world. And I remember years ago, even before the science of reading became popular, attending one of her webinars way back when on phonemic awareness. So it truly is an honor to have her on today. And last week, we were joined by Jessica Farmer talking about fluency and what exactly is fluency. And today we're going to dive deeper on that topic, on why fluency is important. But before we get started, I just want to say welcome to the show, Heather. It's so nice to have you here.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me. And can I just say how much I appreciate the work that you're doing in this space? Your brand, The Colorful Classroom, just represents exactly what I want the world to be for our students and for our teachers. Bright and colorful, engaging and supportive. You just provide so much great information and resources in a way that's accessible and empowering. So thanks for all that you do.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. And I'm all about bringing the joy into literacy. So with our forces combined, evidence-based instruction doesn't have to be dry.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's hear a little more about you. Can you share a bit about your journey in education?
Certainly. So I started my career as a kindergarten teacher. Many of us I know started out as teachers before our careers sort of diverged and took different paths. But I was really fortunate to be paired with an amazing experienced teacher, my good friend Laura Robbins, during my very first year of teaching. And we were in an overcrowded school and there wasn't enough classroom space. So we actually taught in the same classroom. So double the number of students, double the fun, right? And at that time, Laura was doing her master's degree and she was learning about this body of evidence that we now refer to as the science of reading. And I'll tell you, Michelle, at that time, nobody was talking about reading science. The culture was very steeped in whole word memorization, but we were really fortunate in a way that there was no required curriculum. That tells you how long ago it was and what a different world. So there were standards, but no curriculum. So Laura and I could just close our classroom door and do whatever we thought was best for our students. or I should say whatever Laura thought was best for our students. I was so new to teaching. I figured the smartest thing for me to do was whatever my teaching partner of 10 plus years of experience told me to do. And because we were providing our students with that explicit instruction, particularly in phonemic awareness and phonics, we saw great results. And more than 95% of our students left kindergarten as readers. And of course, we now know that those are the kinds of results that we can expect if we give our students high quality instruction. But at that time, those results were amazing. It felt a little bit like magic, in part because there was this really tragic underlying belief that no matter what we did as teachers, about 30% of our students were going to struggle. And of course, we know that that is absolutely not the case. It really comes down to the instruction that students receive. So after about a decade in the classroom, I began working as a private interventionist, and I saw a lot of older students who were having reading struggles. And I thought, if I could teach beginning readers with some of these techniques, then maybe they'll work with older students as well. And sure enough, I got to see firsthand just how many older students were lacking these foundational skills and how their reading and their self-esteem can improve when they get that explicit high-quality literacy instruction. So I then went on to do my graduate work, and my master's thesis was on the topic of phonemic awareness. My doctoral dissertation was on comprehension, and I minored in research and measurement. So that simple view of reading and evidence-based instruction really speak to me. After I completed my graduate work, I spent a decade teaching in a graduate reading program, training teachers to become reading specialists. And now, in my current role as president of Unleashed Innovation, I have the great honor and privilege to work with schools, districts, and other educational organizations and teachers of all varieties and grade levels and so forth to develop and deliver professional development trainings and design curriculum intended to improve student outcomes. So it's really exciting and very gratifying work. And I just need to give a little shout out. One of my proudest professional accomplishments is that I'm one of the co-creators of Sounder and Friends, which is an animated educational adventure series and free app that was specifically developed to draw children's attention to the sounds and spoken words in a really fun and playful way. Because of course, we know that phonemic awareness is that critical foundational skill that contributes to reading fluency. And I just want to let listeners know that since our team has such a strong commitment to educational equity, to date, all of the resources that we produced can be freely accessed. So thanks for letting me have that little shout out.
I love it. And I have the app. I love the app. And I was just watching the other day with my daughter, Trey's ice skates turned into mice skates. And it was so much fun playing along with those sound games. So yes, the app is fantastic. We could also link that all in the show notes in case anyone wants access to that. But I love hearing your backstory and your experience into the structured literacy realm kind of by accident. And what a beautiful way to start out your teaching career with your sidekick there. And we often hear that 95% of students can learn how to read with the right type of instruction. And for you to see that firsthand, implementing evidence-based explicit instruction, deeply rooted in foundational skills, like what a testimony that it did work. And
Absolutely.
For the little ones, it worked for the big ones. And it's just a matter of having the skill set to implement that all.
Definitely. Well said, Michelle.
So let's dive into fluency. And we often hear that fluency is this critical bridge between word recognition and comprehension. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. That's such a great question, Michelle. So there's a good reason that it's been described as that bridge. A lot of it comes down, I believe, to working memory. So working memory is that space where we do our conscious thinking. It's been described as a mental notepad where we can hang on to information, short-term memory, long-term memory, and we use that information to solve a problem or accomplish a goal. And of course, when we're reading, our goal is to understand and to make sense of the text, right? But for students who aren't yet fluent, those students who still have to decode words letter by letter, sound by sound, their working memory is so overburdened with trying to figure out what the words say that they don't have the cognitive resources left to figure out what the words mean. And that's really where fluency comes in. Once students have developed word reading fluency and they can recognize the majority of those words quickly and automatically, effortlessly, they have a lot more space in their mental notepad to work out the meaning of the author's words. Now, that's not to suggest that speed and accuracy are the only important aspects of fluency. We know that that's not the case. Prosody, or reading with appropriate phrasing and expression, is another critical element that supports students in crossing over from mere word calling to understanding how the words and ideas connect to one another, because that's what comprehension is all about. It's about making those connections. So I really think of those three elements, accuracy, rate, prosody, as those supporting structures that enable students to cross over that fluency bridge to comprehension.
Wow, I love that. And we often hear about working memory and cognitive load, but just hearing how you outlined it makes a whole lot of sense, because students are spending their cognitive load decoding the words and not able to translate that information into comprehensible language so that it sounds like comprehensible language. So when you put it that way, it almost feels like fluency is some sort of staircase. We begin with accurate reading. And once you have that accuracy, we can move on to the automaticity. And once we have the automaticity, we can move on to the prosody, or the sing-song nature of our voice. But it's like fluency can't be pinpointed down to one thing. It has to have that buildup, and it's freeing up our working memory in order to have that buildup. So thank you for mentioning that. That makes a lot of sense.
And thinking about fluency as this really complex construct, it's not one single thing, it's a variety of things. And to look at those very different elements and to provide students support integrating all of those elements in order to read fluently and to be able to comprehend what they're reading is critically important.
Yeah, that integration piece is key. So I love talking about the research. We always want to back up our practices with what does the research have to say. So maybe we can chat a bit about how fluency fits into Scarborough's reading rope or other science of reading models such as the active view of reading and what they have to say about it.
Certainly. And I think it's interesting, if you look at those models, you don't always see the word fluency represented. And yet it really is a critical element of all of those models, even if we don't see it explicitly listed. So for example, on Scarborough's reading rope, when we think about those individual strands that comprise word recognition, the phonological awareness, decoding sight word recognition, fluency is really what binds those strands more tightly as students' word recognition becomes increasingly automatic. And it's also what helps to bind the word recognition strands with the language comprehension strands in the way that we described, because it frees up working memory for students to pay attention to the language comprehension elements. And I think the same is true in terms of that active view of reading. I think they actually use the terminology bridging processes. And that's exactly where fluency falls in. It supports students in bridging those lower order word recognition processes with the higher order processes of comprehension.
Yeah, I love how you used the word binding. It's almost as if it's this binding agent, right? The bridging process. And like you mentioned, it's not a strand on the rope itself. It's a result of that rope being more and more tightly wound together. So that's really helpful to even just picture in your brain when you're thinking about fluency. So why do you think fluency is sometimes overlooked in reading instruction? And what do you think are maybe some of the consequences of this oversight?
So thanks for asking. And, Michelle, as you mentioned, I've been around the block a few times. So I do tend to have a bit of a longitudinal view, I think, of this issue. And I think that part of the problem with fluency, like we talked about, is that it isn't just one thing. It includes word reading accuracy, reading rate, expression and phrasing. And I think what I've observed as a profession, sometimes we have this tendency to hyper-focus on one element to the exclusion of others. So not that many years ago, when most students were being taught using balanced literacy, there was a lot of focus on expression and phrasing. But students weren't being taught robust word recognition skills. So their accuracy and their reading rate were suffering. Now we see a lot of schools moving to a more science of reading approach with that strong emphasis on phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding accuracy, which I know you and I are all about. But some programs that I've observed, including Orton Gillingham programs, are really hyper focusing on the accuracy and sometimes that reading rate without any meaningful integration of vocabulary and comprehension, both of which contribute to the prosody element. So I think that's really one of the challenges, and part and parcel of the work that I'm doing now is to find meaningful ways to integrate the word recognition with the comprehension and vocabulary building. Another fluency challenge that I've observed in this current climate is that students are reading a lot of decodable text. And that's a great thing. There are lots of advantages to using decodable text, especially with our beginning and struggling readers. We know that those texts can build up students' confidence. They reinforce and solidify students' understandings of specific phonics patterns and help to build a more robust understanding of the alphabetic principle overall. We know that use of decodable text can help students build those neural pathways that underlie automatic word recognition, which we know is essential for reading fluency. And all of that is great. As I mentioned, you and I were all about it. But let's be honest, decodable stories can sound a little bit stilted. The language is a little awkward, right? It can be hard for students to read some of those stories with natural sounding expression because the language is not natural sounding. Now, I do have to say, shout out to some wonderful authors out there. Decodable texts have gotten a lot better in recent years, and there are some really great decodable stories that I know I recommend. I know you do as well. But by their very definition, decodable stories are not going to have the most natural sounding language. And that's going to make it more challenging for students to read those texts with what we're going to describe as appropriate expression and phrasing. So I'm certainly not suggesting that we don't use decodable text. That is not the case at all. Just that we really need to be deliberate about ensuring that students have meaningful opportunities, potentially including opportunities with decodable text, to improve not just their word recognition and rate, but also their prosody.
That's such a valid point to make. And oftentimes when we think about decodable text, different people have different opinions. But if you truly have 100% decodability, not including high frequency words, so you're omitting words such as and the that are not yet decodable, the syntax is going to sound very unnatural. And it's often written in a way that we don't speak. And so if we're trying to have students have this comprehensible conversational language, it just doesn't quite work out the same way until either more phonics skills are applied into that text or more high frequency words are involved in the text in order for that syntax to feel a little bit more natural. So
Absolutely.
That's such a valid point.
And I do think that it does provide an interesting opportunity. One of the things that I've observed watching students encounter more decodable text and interact with them in a more meaningful way is that in part because of that slightly stilted phrasing or low frequency vocabulary that's being used, because the author can only use decodable text, or the sentence structure, as you mentioned, it actually forces students to work a little bit harder to make sense of it. And the harder we work, those are thinking muscles. And so the more we exercise those muscles, the heavier the lift, the stronger we become. And so I do think there are some tremendous opportunities for using decodable text, perhaps not exclusively for fluency. That's not necessarily going to be appropriate, but we can certainly embed some comprehension instruction into some of those small group reading experiences and so forth. So as you mentioned earlier, Michelle, it's really all about integrating all of those elements with whatever text students are working with.
Yeah, that's so smart to say. And Tim Rosinski is often viewed as the father of fluency, and he has done such great work around fluency. And I remember reading once about his opinion on repeated readings and that it should be a little bit of a stretch text. And if we are setting students up with a text that they can slide through all of the words very simply, the repeated reading is not going to be as effective. So there has to be a slight challenge there in order to have that cognitive stretch and having success for the repeated reading as well. So that's a little tidbit as well.
Mm-hmm. It's really hard to have a conversation about fluency without Tim Rosinski's name coming up, right?
Let's think about some challenges that students may face now. So, what are some signs that a teacher may see if they're noticing fluency challenges with their students that might be affecting comprehension work?
Sure. Well, whenever we have concerns about a student's comprehension, whether it's difficulty with retelling or maybe recalling important details, we might have a student who struggles to answer comprehension questions or find the main idea. It's always really important to take a close look at that student's reading fluency because, of course, word recognition and reading rate and accuracy are really important contributors to understanding. So to do that, we really have to have the student read out loud. And I know when we work with the early primary students, the room is abuzz with those voices reading text. But sometimes, even by the end of second grade, moving into third grade, students are expected to do a lot of silent reading. So I think teachers really need to understand we want to make sure we have students reading aloud, not necessarily always in front of their peer group. Certainly some of those struggling readers, it can be even traumatizing for them to be singled out in front of a class and humiliating themselves with a text that below grade level readers are by definition unable to cope with the demands of grade level text. So we want to make sure we're doing it in a very sensitive and judicious manner. But in order to find out where, if we look at that simple view of reading, it tells us that reading comprehension, if we have difficulties, there are going to be difficulties either with the word recognition, which is where the fluency side of the house tends to reside, or with the language comprehension, or potentially with both. So the only way to sift that out is to listen to the children read aloud and make sure that we're making those observations. And obviously, if we see students who are actively sounding out words or even hesitating before a word, oftentimes I talk to teachers about when we see those hesitations. Sometimes it is choppy reading, poor fluency, but in my experience, most often it's a word recognition problem or a word accuracy problem. That child is trying to figure out what that word says. So when we see those hesitations, we want to really carefully look at those words and decide what is it about that word that student doesn't recognize it automatically. So those are all red flags. And of course, we also want to be on a lookout for a lack of expression or poor phrasing. And poor prosody and poor comprehension really go hand in hand. And one of the things that I've observed, because I have been using explicit science-based instruction for a very long time, is that oftentimes students who start off as struggling readers may have been remediated. However, at some point along the way during their struggles, they had to let go of trying to make sense of the text. So they become word callers. And we can teach them those word recognition strategies, but we're not necessarily going to automatically remediate the reading comprehension issues that come along with that. They're not necessarily going to start monitoring for comprehension just because now they're saying the words correctly. So those are all things I think that we really want to look at. But truly, anytime we're seeing a reading comprehension problem, fluency should be on the table. We should be taking a very close look at it.
That is such a valid point. I know gone are the days of running records, but nothing replaces hearing a child read aloud because it can be very telling to have that information. And I know last week, Jessica and I were speaking about the ORF and assessing oral reading fluency in that 1-minute passage and how much valuable information you can get from that and how that is research-based and being such a great predictor of comprehension as well, even though it's only assessing the accuracy and automaticity portion, not quite the prosody, but that's a great starting point for a red flag as well. And I love how you were going a little bit deeper because it all goes back to those science of reading models as well. When we are only word callers and you're only honing in on the word recognition and ignoring the language comprehension, something is compromised. And so it really shows that both have to be kind of fostered in tandem. And it's not that we're developing word recognition first and then moving on to language comprehension after that. We have to do it all at the same time so that that integration piece is happening. So winding of the ropes is happening in order for fluency to occur.
Most definitely.
So I know that you and Jessica and your other partner in crime have a wonderful webinar right around the corner, top 10 tips all about fluency. So would you share one of your favorite instructional methods or strategies that teachers can implement in their classrooms in order to improve fluency outcomes?
Absolutely. I'd be excited to. So, one of the tips we're going to be sharing at the webinar is really the value of building fluency and recognizing high frequency irregular words in the context of phrases or sentences, not just through word lists. And happily, those of us who are science reading educators, we've seen this shift from requiring students to memorize words on that Dolch list or the Fry list to introducing high frequency irregular words through the heartword approach, which is a great development. And if anyone is not familiar with this approach, Really Great Reading has a terrific site for introducing those high frequency irregular words. So maybe you would also be kind enough to provide that link, Michelle. But once those words have been explicitly taught, we know that we need to give kids practice, practice, practice in order to recognize those words automatically, because that's our goal, right? For students to recognize those words quickly, accurately, effortlessly, for them to become sight words. And that's what is called orthographic mapping. And we know through the work of Linnea Airy that orthographic mapping bonds three elements of a word: the sound structure, the phonology, the spelling or the orthography, and the meaning. And the challenge with many of these high frequency irregular words is that they don't carry meaning. And, we think of words like the, of. I don't know about you, but I don't have any idea how to explain to a student what any of those words mean in isolation. I know what part of speech they are. I know what they mean in the context of a phrase or a sentence. But in isolation, I would argue that they really don't have any meaning. So if our goal is to give students the practice that they need to orthographically map those high frequency irregular words, doesn't it make sense to have them practice the words in context? Because it's almost like they're missing a piece of the puzzle. We're sending it home for them to practice, 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 but we're not giving them all of the pieces that they need for their brain to actually make that connection, to bond those elements of the word together. So that's just one of the tips that we're going to be discussing a bit further. And I'm excited to share that as part of the Top 10 Tips Handbook, we've actually included fluency grids with phrases and sentences targeting the high frequency irregular words in connection with an explicit scope and sequence. So I'm really excited about that. And it's funny that you should mention Tim Rosinski earlier. I was listening to one of his podcasts recently, and actually practicing those high frequency irregular words in context is one of the things that he recommends as well. So
I love that. And that makes so much sense. And even when people are speaking about orthographic mapping, I think oftentimes they forget about the meaning aspect. And it's all about the grapheme phoneme correspondences and bonding the sounds and the symbols. But in order to truly map a word in your brain, we have to take meaning into account. But you're so right about these function words, because in isolation, we will all be stifled trying to define them. So having that context piece makes so much sense. So that is such a great tip. And I am so excited to hear what else you have to say about that, because I know you're going to go so much deeper on that tip as well.
Thank you.
I know this was a lot of great information, and some teachers may be feeling stifled or unsure on some of their practices in terms of fluency development for their students. So do you have any advice on a mindset shift or an action step that you want to leave with our listeners?
Absolutely. So like we talked about, Michelle, fluency is a really complex construct. There's a lot going on in terms of fluency, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight. And like you, I am a big believer in supporting teachers, making sure that information is manageable. We're all doing our best, and when we know a little bit better, we can do a little bit better. We can't take on everything all at once. So my suggestion really, first of all, is to be kind with yourself. Pick, maybe just one simple, very achievable step at a time before you dive in a little bit further. But I really encourage us as educators to rethink fluency, not just in terms of that definition of, rate and accuracy and prosody, but thinking of it in terms of automaticity and practicing to automaticity. And if we look at reading, there are so many skills that underlie reading. There's the phonemic awareness piece, there's, the phonics piece, there's vocabulary and so forth. So if we look at each one of those separate elements, the decoding element, if you will, giving students the amount of practice that they need to achieve mastery, to reach fluency in that particular subskill. I think it was Nathaniel Swain. I was listening to another podcast, and he talked about if you're not fluent reading unfamiliar text on the first read, you're not fluent enough. And so as much as, rereading and so forth is wonderful, those are great strategies to practice and help students build that understanding of what fluency is and model that language and so forth. We really want to teach each and every one of those subskills to the level that students are fluent in each of those various subskills. So thinking in terms of that, if we do find a student and we notice that reading is disfluent, what is it about their reading fluency that is problematic? How can we step in and provide support in that area? So maybe they've got a good reading rate, but poor prosody, or maybe their reading is accurate, but very stilted and halting and so forth. So sort of let's break it down a little bit more, and we can take one thing at a time. And as much as you and I have been talking about how important it is to integrate, all of these pillars of reading, if you will, as teachers, we can provide explicit instruction in each of those individual elements or strands, if you will. So hopefully that's helpful. And again, I'm excited for our webinar in a month or so that we can chat a little bit more about some of these topics.
Wow, what a great note to end on. That was such a valuable piece of advice to truly, truly pinpoint, because even in terms of strategy of instruction, and you're thinking about, I need to lump all of my students who need fluency support all together. Truly, they can all have different underlying issues. So
absolutely,
the magnifying glass and truly pinpoint the fluency issue at hand is really, really important work. All right, Heather, this has been so wonderful. I'm sure my listeners would love to connect with you further. So where would they be able to find you?
Well, thanks, Michelle. And anyone looking to connect with me can check out my website. As I mentioned, I'm president of Unleashed Innovation. So we're at www.unleashed-innovation.com. So there's a contact form there. Certainly, they're most welcome to email me. I'm at hkenny@unleashed-innovation.com. I'm also part of the Sounder and Friends team, and we have a very active presence on Instagram and Facebook. So do feel free to reach out that way. And then, as we talked about, I'm part of our top 10 tips team, along with Jessica Farmer of Farmer Loves Phonics and Laura Robbins, who is my Sounder and Friends co-creator. So certainly, if you connect with them, and you can always get to me through either one of them as well.
Wonderful. We can link all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much, Heather, for coming on and chatting about the importance of fluency. I know this has been such an information-packed episode that so many teachers are going to find so valuable. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate you having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.